Senator from Vermont, Mr. Sanders, for himself and Mr. Merkley, proposes an amendment numbered 5210 to amendment numbered 5194.
Madam President, I would ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading of the amendment.
Without objection.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that for the duration of the Senate's consideration of H.R. 5376, the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022, the majority Republican managers of the bill, while seated or standing at the manager's desk, be permitted to deliver floor remarks, retrieve, review, and edit documents, and send email and other data communications from text displayed on wireless personal digital assistant devices and tablet devices. I further ask unanimous consent that the use of calculators be permitted on the floor during consideration of the bill. Further, that the staff be permitted to make technical and conforming changes to the bill, if necessary, consistent with the amendments adopted during Senate consideration. Finally, that the following staff members from my staff and from Senator Graham's staff be given all access floor passes for consideration of the bill. Majority staff: Michael Jones, Joshua Smith, Tyler Evelsheiser, Melissa Kaplan-Pistiner, and Billy Jindal. Republican staff: Nick Myers, Matthew Giroux, Matthew Joe Keeley, Becky Cole, and Craig Abil.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I want to take a moment to say a few words about the so-called Inflation Reduction Act that we are debating this evening. And I say so-called, by the way, because according to the CBO and other economic organizations who have studied this bill, it will in fact have a minimal impact on inflation. Madam President, let me put this reconciliation bill into the context of where we are as a nation politically and economically. And the answer to that as to where we are is we are not in a good place. According to the most recent Gallup poll, the approval rate for Congress is at 16%, with 82% of the American people disapproving of the work we are doing here. 16 think we're doing a good job, 82% think not. Further, according to a recent University of Chicago poll, a strong majority of Americans, and this is extremely important, and I hope members of Congress hear this, a majority of Americans believe that the government is, quote, corrupt and rigged against me, end of quote. People believe the government is corrupt and rigged against them. Further, according to a USA Today poll that came out last week, a very strong majority no longer believe that the Democratic or Republican parties are responding to their needs, and we need to move to a multi-party system. And I think what is most frightening in terms of where the American people are politically today is that there is actually a growing number of Americans who believe that they may have to take up arms against their own government in order to accomplish what they think needs to be done. Madam President, all of this speaks to a very, very dangerous moment for American democracy, and in a number of ways it resembles the conditions that existed in Europe in the 1920s and early 1930s, which led to fascism and totalitarianism. In other words, at a time when so many of our people are hurting, many of them no longer believe that in our democratic system, government is capable of responding to their needs, and they are losing faith in our democracy. The people of this country believe, and in my view correctly, that we have a corrupt political system dominated by the wealthy and the powerful, and that we have a rigged economy in which large corporations are seeing huge profits, some cases heaviest profits ever, while the middle class and working families continue to see a decline in their standard of living. Let me just give you one small example of what is going on, and that is within the last few weeks, while Americans continue to pay outrageously high gas prices at the pump, prices are going down, but they're still a lot higher than they were a year ago, 2 years ago. And while people pay high prices, Exxon, Mobil, Shell, and BP reported a record-breaking $46 billion in profits during the second quarter. People pay more at the gas pump. The major oil companies are seeing huge profits. In terms of the extremely high price of prescription drugs, 3 large pharmaceutical companies, Pfizer, Johnson & Johnson, and AbbVie, increased their profits last year by 90% to $54 billion, a 90% increase in their profits, while so many of our people cannot afford the high cost of prescription drugs. Madam President, that is what a rigged economy is all about. Huge corporate profits, while working people cannot afford the basic necessities of life. Madam President, let us be clear about where we are as a nation, and that is the American people are tired of press releases, they're tired of 30-second ads, they're tired of speeches. They are hurting, and they are begging their elected officials to respond to their needs. And if you want to know why there is so much anger and so much frustration and so much disillusionment within our society today, it's important to understand that real weekly wages for the average American worker are lower today than they were 49 years ago. And clearly, the inflation of today is pushing the average person even further behind. Not so many years ago, when I was a kid, it was possible for one worker in a family, like my father, never made much money, to earn enough money to take care of his kids and the family. Today, that is a rarity. Today, it is necessary in almost all cases for 2 workers in a family to have to go out to work. Today, Madam President, despite the huge increases in our economy, despite the tremendous explosion of technology, everything being equal, our younger generation will have a lower standard of living than their parents, have a harder time finding a home, having a harder time affording, being able to have a family. Imagine that, our younger generation having a lower standard of living than their parents. Madam President, half of our people today live paycheck to paycheck, and many millions are working for starvation wages, 9, 10, 11 bucks an hour. Further, many workers around the country who want to join a union and engage in collective bargaining at companies like Starbucks, Amazon, and other places are facing fierce and illegal anti-union resistance. And I have to say, Madam President, that this legislation does not address any of their needs. This legislation does not address the reality that we have more income and wealth inequality today than at any time in the last 100 years, where 3 people own more wealth than the bottom half of America. Doesn't address the fact that 95% of all new income is going to the top 1%. Doesn't address the reality that CEOs of major corporations are making 350 times what their workers are making. Madam President, I think everybody knows that we have a completely dysfunctional healthcare system. We now spend over $12,000 a year per person, more than double what other countries spend. Today, over 70 million Americans are uninsured or underinsured, and there are studies out there that say that some 60,000 people a year die because they're uninsured or underinsured and they don't get to a doctor on time. Meanwhile, every year, the insurance companies make tens of billions of dollars in profit. So we have a system in which the cost is outrageously high. People are dying because they don't get to a doctor on time. This bill does nothing to address the systemic dysfunctionality of the American healthcare system. Does nothing. Madam President, in terms of our kids, the future of our nation, shamefully, we have the highest rate of childhood poverty of almost any major nation on earth. This bill, as currently written, does nothing to address that. Madam President, our child care system is dysfunctional. If a working family is lucky enough to find a slot for their young one, on average, they will pay about $15,000 a year for child care, an impossibly high sum of money. Imagine that, $15,000 a year for child care if you're making $40,000 or $50,000. That is an absurd sum of money. Yet this bill turns its back on the working parents of this country and our children, does not begin to address the child care or pre-K crisis that we face. Madam President, a nation will be as great and competitive as its educational system is. And yet today, hundreds of thousands of bright young kids all across this country are unable to afford a higher education. Imagine that. In the richest country in the history of the world, when we need the best educated workforce possible, we've got hundreds of thousands of young people cannot afford a higher education, and we have 45 million Americans who are struggling with student debt, sometimes outrageous levels of student debt. This bill, as currently written, does nothing to address it. Madam President, today, millions of elderly Americans and half of our senior citizens are trying to survive on $25,000 a year or less. Millions of senior citizens are unable to afford to go to a dentist. Imagine that. In the richest country on earth, elderly people can't afford to go to a dentist. Their teeth are rotting in their mouths. They can't afford hearing aids in order to hear what their kids, grandchildren have to say. They can't afford eyeglasses. This bill ignores that issue, does nothing to expand Medicare to cover those very basic health care needs. The result, millions of seniors will continue to have rotten teeth and lack the dentures, hearing aids, or eyeglasses they deserve. Madam President, and I hear this all of the time in Vermont, and I expect my colleagues hear it as well, so many of our elderly and disabled people would much prefer to stay in their homes rather than be forced into nursing homes. They need someone to come to their home to help them with their basic needs. I don't think anyone denies that we have a major crisis in home health care. And the people who are doing home health care now, and God bless them all, are usually overworked and underpaid. This bill, as currently written, does nothing to address that crisis. Madam President, again, no debate. Everybody agrees that we have a major housing crisis in America. Some 600,000 people are homeless. sleeping out on the streets in every state in this country. In addition to the homeless issue, nearly 18 million households are paying 50% or more of their limited incomes for housing. Imagine that. Imagine that, what it means. How do you have any money to do anything else when you're paying 50% of your limited income for housing? Yet this bill does nothing to address the major housing crisis that we face or build one unit of safe and affordable housing. Just another issue that we push aside. And I would say, Madam President, and every working person understands this, that while ordinary people are struggling with child care, with health care, with housing, with the basic necessities of life, the people on top today are doing phenomenally well. During the pandemic alone, the billionaire class saw an almost $2 trillion increase in their wealth. So that, in a snapshot, is where we are as a nation today. Working people are hurting. In many ways, their standard of living is in decline. People on top are doing phenomenally well. And that takes us to where we are this evening. The importance of the bill that we are considering this evening is that it is not a normal, not a regular piece of legislation. It is a reconciliation bill. And I know that to anybody outside of the Beltway, that doesn't mean much. But what it does mean is that unlike regular legislation here in the Senate, this bill does not require 60 votes to get passed. All we need to get this bill passed are 50 votes plus the Vice President, if it is a tie. Now, I say this in all honesty, that it is extremely sad to me, and I think the American people, that up to this point, we have not had one Republican come forward and say, you know what, I want to work on the housing crisis, on the health care crisis, on the education crisis, on the home health care crisis. Sadly, we have not had one Republican come forward who is prepared to stand up for working families, for the children, for the elderly, or for the environment. That is a sad state of affairs. But here is the truth. If all 50 members of the Democratic caucus were to stand together today, we could pass some enormously important amendments which would have a profound impact on improving the lives of working people in our country, and maybe, just maybe, could begin the process of restoring faith in our democracy. Poll after poll makes it clear. Not only are the American people hurting, they want Congress to take bold action to improve their lives. And under the budget reconciliation process, we have the opportunity to do that. And if we don't do it now, when all we need are 50 votes, it is quite questionable as to when, in fact, we will ever do that. In other words, what I am asking today is for all 50 members of the Democratic caucus to come together and begin the process of addressing some, not all, some of the major crises facing working families. It is absolutely imperative that we show the American people that we are capable of representing the needs of ordinary people, not just billionaire campaign contributors, not just lobbyists, but ordinary people who are hurting today. And if we cannot do that, not only will people continue to hurt and suffer, but to my mind, it is questionable for how long we remain a democracy. Now, Madam President, let me say a few words about what is in this legislation. A bill which has some good features, but also, in my view, has some very bad features. This bill deals with three major areas: prescription drugs, climate, and taxation. Let me deal with at least two of them. Prescription drugs. Now, I know that in Vermont, and I suspect in Wisconsin and all over this country, people are outraged at the fact that they are paying so much for prescription drugs. They are outraged that in some cases we pay 10 times more than Canada and other countries for the same exact product. Now, the good news is, Madam President, that this bill, this reconciliation bill, will do what should have been done many years ago, something that many of us called for many years ago, and that it will allow Medicare to begin negotiating prescription drug prices with the pharmaceutical industry. Now, that is not a radical idea. That is an idea that exists in probably every other major country on earth. And that is why their prices are so much lower. They don't let the drug companies charge any price that they want. So that's the good news. But here, Madam President, is the bad news, and we must be honest about it. At a time when so many of our people cannot afford the prescription drugs they need, and 1 out of 4 Americans can't even fill the prescription their doctors write, this Medicare negotiating provision will not go into effect for 4 years, at which time only 10 drugs will be negotiated, with more to come in later years. So, if anybody thinks that as a result of this bill we're suddenly going to see lower prices for Medicare, you are mistaken. Ain't going to happen next year, the year after, the year after, the year after. And by the way, given the incredible power of the pharmaceutical industry, I would suspect even money that they will figure out a way to get around this provision if it takes 4 years to implement. So, this provision will have no impact on the prices for those Americans. Furthermore, this provision will have no impact on the prices for those Americans who are not on Medicare. So if you're under 65, this bill will not impact you at all, and the drug companies will be able to continue to go on their merry way and raise prices to any level that they want. Madam President, under this bill, at a time when the drug companies are enjoying huge profits, the pharmaceutical industry will still be allowed to charge the American people by far the highest prices in the world for prescription drugs. So that is the reality of this bill. What do we do? Well, if we are serious about responding to what the American people want, in the polling that I have seen, it's like 70 or 80% of the people understand that prescription drugs are much too high. They want us to act. This bill, unfortunately, does not do that. If we are serious about reducing the price of prescription drugs, we know exactly how we can do it. For over 30 years, the Veterans Administration has been negotiating with the pharmaceutical industry to lower the cost of prescription drugs. Moreover, for decades, virtually every other country on earth has been doing the same thing. The result of where we are today is that Medicare pays twice as much for the exact same prescription drugs as the VA and people all over this country. In some cases, as I mentioned earlier, we may pay up to 10 times as much for a particular drug. In other words, when it comes to reducing the price of prescription drugs under Medicare, we do not have to reinvent the wheel. We could simply require Medicare to pay no more for prescription drugs than the VA. That is not a radical idea. That is a simple idea. You got one government agency doing what they're doing for 30 years. All we have to do is have Medicare do the same. And if we did that, we could literally cut the price of prescription drugs under Medicare in half in a matter of months, not years. And that is why I am introducing an amendment today to do just that. Under this amendment, we could save Medicare $900 billion over the next decade. This is nine times more savings than the rather weak negotiation provisions currently in the bill. We could save $900 billion by negotiating rather than $100 billion. The reason that we pay the highest prices in the world for prescription drugs is not hard to understand. During the past 20 years, the pharmaceutical industry has spent over $5 billion on lobbying and over $500 million in campaign contributions. Further, the pharmaceutical industry has, over the years, mounted an unprecedented lobbying effort in Washington and in states all across this country. Now, what is unbelievable, if you want to know what a corrupt political system is about, if you want to know what money in politics is about, if you want to know what corporate greed is about, if you want to know why we pay the highest prices in the world for prescription drugs, please understand that right now, at this moment, the pharmaceutical industry has more than 1,700 well-paid lobbyists on Capitol Hill to protect their interests, including former congressional leaders of both major political parties. They buy Democratic leaders, they buy Republican leaders, they buy former members of Congress. 1,700 well-paid lobbyists to make sure they continue to rip off the American people and charge us the highest prices in the world for prescription drugs. That is over 3 lobbyists for every 1 member of Congress. 535 members of Congress, 1,700 lobbyists. Mr. President, just yesterday, and this is really interesting, and I think it brings it all out, the CEO of Pharma, his name is Steve Ubel, I think, basically said, and I appreciate his honesty and straightforward, he said, anybody who votes even for this incredibly tepid bill, he said, we are going to go after you. He stated, and I love this, the kind of modesty, he said, quote, few associations have all the tools of modern political advocacy at their disposal in the way that Pharma does, end of quote. In other words, if you dare to vote in any way to lower the cost of prescription drugs, we're going to spend all of the money we have, and we have endless, unlimited amounts of money against you. That is what a corrupt political system is about. That's what corporate greed is about. Basically, the CEO of Pharma saying, you vote for this bill, you can expect millions and millions of dollars of 30-second ads against you. That's where we are in the state of our democracy today. Madam President, Mr. President, prescription drugs is a huge issue, but it's not the only issue that is dealt with inadequately in this legislation. It is my view, I think it is the view of the majority of American people, it is certainly the view of the scientific community that climate change is an existential threat to that planet. Now, that sounds like a big word, existential. But what it means, if we don't get our act together, there may not be a planet that is healthy and habitable for our children and grandchildren. It is very fundamental. Do we protect future generations? Mr. President, this legislation provides $370 billion over the next decade to combat climate change and to invest in so-called energy security programs. Now, the good news and it is good news, is that this legislation, as currently written, would provide more funding for energy efficiency and sustainable energy than has ever been invested before. That is the good news. But, Mr. President, the bad news is that this bill, as currently written, includes a huge giveaway to the fossil fuel industry, both in the reconciliation bill that we are considering and in a side deal that was just made public a few days ago. Mr. President, under this legislation, the fossil fuel industry will receive billions of dollars in new tax breaks and subsidies over the next 10 years, on top of the $15 billion in tax breaks and corporate welfare that they already receive every year. And interestingly enough, Mr. President, that may well be the reason why BP, one of the largest oil companies in the world, supports this bill. It may be the reason why Shell, another huge oil company, supports this bill. And it is the reason, I suspect, why the CEO of ExxonMobil is pleased by many of the provisions included in this deal. So we've got to think a little bit about what it means when major oil companies who are in the process of destroying the planet support this legislation. Under this bill, up to 60 million acres of public waters must be offered up for sale each and every year to the oil and gas industry before the federal government could approve any new offshore wind development. To put that in perspective, 60 million acres is the size of the state of Michigan. Further, under this bill, up to 2 million acres of public lands must be offered up for sale each and every year to the oil and gas industry before leases can move forward for any renewable energy development on public lands. In total, this bill will offer the fossil fuel industry up to 700 million acres of public lands and waters to oil and gas drilling over the next decade, far more than the oil and gas industry could possibly use. And, Mr. President, that is not all. The fossil fuel industry will not just benefit from the provisions in the reconciliation bill as currently written. A deal has also been reached to make it easier for the fossil fuel industry to receive permits for their oil and gas projects. This deal would approve the $6.6 billion Mountain Valley Pipeline, a fracked gas pipeline that would span over 300 miles from West Virginia to Virginia and potentially on to North Carolina. This is a pipeline that would generate emissions equivalent to that released by 37 coal plants or by over 27 million cars each and every year. Mr. President, let me quote from a July 29th letter from over 350 environmental organizations, including Friends of the Earth, Food and Water Watch, and the Climate Justice Alliance, expressing concerns about this bill. And I quote, "Any approval of new fossil fuel projects or fast-tracking of fossil fuel permitting is incompatible with climate leadership. Oil, gas, and coal production are the core drivers of the climate and extinction crises. There can be no new fossil fuel leases, exports, or infrastructure if we have any hope of preventing ever-worsening climate crises, catastrophic floods, deadly wildfires, and more, all of which are ripping across the country as we speak. We are out of time. Therefore, we, these 350 organizations, are calling on you, as the President, leadership of Congress, to fulfill your promise to lead on Congress, starting with denying approvals for the Mountain Valley Pipeline, rejecting all new federal fossil fuel leases onshore in the Gulf of Mexico and Alaska and everywhere else, and preventing any fast-track permits for fossil fuel projects. Mr. President, I would ask unanimous consent to insert the full letter into the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. And here is what the Center for Biological Diversity had to say on this bill. Quote, "This is a climate suicide pact. It is self-defeating to handcuff renewable energy development to massive new oil and gas extraction. The new leasing required in this bill will fan the flames of the climate disasters torching our country, and it's a slap in the face to the communities fighting to protect themselves from filthy fossil fuels, end quote. Now, Mr. President, in my view, we have got to do everything we can to take on the greed, the irresponsibility, the destructiveness of the fossil fuel industry, not give billions of dollars in corporate welfare to an industry that has been destroying our planet. And that is why I will be introducing an amendment today to strike all of the benefits to the fossil fuel industry that are in this bill, and I will be asking for a roll call vote on it. And, Mr. President, let me say a word about some of the other amendments that I'll be introducing. I will be introducing an amendment that is widely popular. The concept is widely popular, and that is to expand Medicare to provide dental, vision, and hearing benefits. This amendment is fully paid for by demanding that the wealthiest people start paying their fair share of taxes. Further, I will be introducing an amendment to provide $30 billion to establish the Civilian Conservation Corps, which would create 400,000 jobs for young people to combat climate change. The entire younger generation wants to roll up their sleeves and get involved in the effort to transform our energy system away from fossil fuel. And this amendment and the establishment of a Civilian Conservation Corps would allow them to do that. And further, Mr. President, I will be introducing an amendment to expand the $300 a month child tax credit for the next 5 years by restoring the top corporate tax rate from 21 to 28%. As you know, we made significant progress in lowering childhood poverty in America. We reduced it by 40% with the establishment of a child tax credit, but unfortunately, that was not continued in this year, and I think it needs to do so. So, bottom line, this is where we are at. The American people are hurting. Tens of millions of workers are falling further and further behind. The elderly are hurting. The kids are hurting. And people are looking to their elected representatives in Washington to finally address the crises that they are facing. And in a reconciliation bill, where we only need 50 votes and the vice president, we have the capability, if we pass these amendments, of taking a giant step forward, not only in addressing the needs of our kids, our elderly and working families, but it may be, just maybe, beginning to restore the confidence of the American people in their democracy, in believing that their elected officials are listening to them and not just lobbyists and wealthy campaign contributors. So I would look forward to offering these amendments and getting them passed. And I thank the President very much and yield the floor.
The senior senator from South Carolina is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I yield myself 20 minutes from the